this is such an amazing invitation, and like I was sharing with the team, I could not say no. For many years, I would say over a decade, Uma Mem has put me on the spot, interviewing me and being the moderator in many, many feminist conversations and seminars. And today it's my chance. So I shall grab this opportunity and try to have a conversation with Uma Mem, which is both, I feel, deeply personal, political, and also a journey that I've been privileged enough to, I think, travel with Uma Mem since 1994. We go back a long, long way. Um, but before I start this conversation, I would like to um, acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'm zooming in from Melbourne, and I acknowledge that I'm on occupied land. I pay my respects to seniors past, present, and future. Thank you very much for the invitation, Partners for Law in Development. And I can see that this is an organization that is focused on social justice and women's rights. And I think throughout Uma Mem's career and also activism, this is one segment that has been central in her life. I see that Uma Mem is also a part of the organization, and I feel very, very happy that we are trying to archive her work and this conversation together. I tried to look up her work. She has been my teacher for the longest time. And Uma Mem, please correct me, but one of the first books that I can see online is The Social um, dimension, Dimensions of Inequality of Early Buddhism in 1987. And since that time, I think you have written many more books. In 1998, Rewriting History, The Life and Times of Pandita Ramabai. In 2002, Gendering Caste Through a Feminist Lens. 2004, the Social Philosophy of Buddhism and the Problems of Inequality. And again in 2007, you wrote another book on Pandita Ramabai, A Life and Time. 2006, we are looking at the everyday lives of histories, and 2013, conceptualizing Brahminical patriarchy in early India. And this is completely an incomplete, I think, list of the work that you have done, because I know that you were part of the Zuban Impunity project, and you were part of many other projects where you spearheaded conversations. One of the things that I'm very interested to ask you is to begin with how you have bridged your scholarship as a feminist historian with a medium like documentary filmmaking. And I was thinking about films as an archive, and I think we'll get to all the documentaries that you have made, bit by bit. But in a sense, to throw this question at you, as films and archives, by becoming a documentary filmmaker as a feminist historian, has it allowed you to experiment with the plurality of the voices in the archives, Uma Mem?
Yeah, that's a good question to begin with. I'm reminded of something that a filmmaker called Hansal Mehta, who's made the film called Shahid, where he talks about a young lawyer who ultimately gets killed, and then has now made a film called on Harsh Mehta, one of the big financial scams early in history. He said in an interview that every filmmaker is a historian, because actually filmmakers are recording history of their own times. In some ways they choose subjects and they speak to a community which is located very much in time. So I think the relationship between a historian writing and then at some point of time maybe make the leap and go into filmmaking, there's a link. And particularly in my case, the link comes from the fact that I was doing women's history ever since the women's movement began in India. In this last phase in the 80s, I veered towards writing on women. And the archive, as you all might know, is highly skewed. The archive, the historian's archive, is basically a top-down, great men type of archive. And it's not easy to write histories of the marginal people, whether they are marginalized communities, and women did do feature as a marginalized voice from the point of view of the public archive. So in a sense, when you start working on writing on women, you are actually struck by the inadequacy of the archive, the public archive, because there's hardly anything that you'd find in the big national archives and so on. And so that forces you to actually, but politically in any case, the lives of the great do not excite me as much as the lives of ordinary people. And actually, it's the anonymous person who is the subject of my interest. It would be, and how can you write their histories, because their histories are not documented. They're not left behind sources of a certain kind. And a quiet little entry is actually the story of a completely unknown woman whom one could recover, this person called Subbalakshmi. You could recover her only because she left behind an extraordinarily rich archive, quote unquote, which was in a trunk. It's fragments of paper left in a trunk that became the subject of history, in which her granddaughter recovered it. And later on, I felt this was an exciting project from the point of view of making a film on, because it was visually very powerful. You know, the archive itself has a charge. The material, the fragments of paper, the writing of people whom nobody knows actually, but it's their handwriting, it's their the paper of their times and so on. It's quite exciting and fascinating to actually recover that material and then try and put those fragments together and make sense of a person's life, lived or unlived, because that would depend on whether they felt that the challenge, they lived the lives according to their own choices, or they were circumscribed by other constraints. So it's actually, I think in a sense, my relationship to history is the continuum. I mean, it's that, and to women's history is the thread that links me as a historian with me as a filmmaker, because my films are really all about women, and really are fairly unknown women, and they are about uncovering the lives of people and their times. So it's really the times that they live in that is also exciting. That are what are the choices that were available? How did these women live their lives? The other thing that I think is exciting is that the medium being different is a challenge. But I'll leave that question for the next. I think this is enough for the first question that you asked me.
All right. So some friends were saying I wasn't loud enough. Is it louder? Is it clearer? Just give me a thumbs up. Yeah. All right, great. So, Uma ma'am, I'm going to take a few steps back and go back to your training as a historian at Banaras University. And at what point in your training as a historian did you get a self of you becoming a feminist historian? And how did your training in history, right? Because we speak so much about the archive, and somehow the archive, I'll come to that later in terms of the archive and the memory, the living memory, that's failing, and you're so trying to bring it together. But let's leave that for the second part of our conversation. But coming to your training as a historian, Uma ma'am, how does it link, let's say, to a work like The Lives and Times of Pandita Ramabai? What was kind of archival work that you did? And was she really an unknown figure that you had to go through that process of retrieving her story?
Yeah, well, let me begin by saying that I'm actually completely untrained as a historian. No, honestly. And the reason is that I was, and this is actually the life history. See, I could not study history because I didn't have the money to go and live in a hostel. And the place that I was living in, Bangalore, did not have an MA in history. So I was perforce forced to become what is called a private student. So I was an external student in Banaras University, and my only relationship with Banaras was to take a train for 2 years, once a year, with a box full of books, go live in the hostel over there for 15 days, write my exams, and come back. Okay, that was my only relationship with Banaras University. So I'm an untaught historian, right? So but I learned my history as a teacher. So when I became a teacher in Miranda House, I was living history in some ways, because I was also very excitingly poised at that moment when young women in Miranda House were asking a series of questions. They were the ones who were actually leading on the question of the women's, why are, and it all began with something as inconsequential, but not really so, as we used to have a tradition called electing from amongst the freshers. You would elect a person who would be called Miss Miranda, because she would be so it was actually some form of a beauty contest. Now, this was just the moment when the women's movement was beginning. You must remember, this is 67, 68, 69. The women's movement is hitting everywhere. And the questions start off in Miranda House amongst these young women saying, what is this nonsense? What is this canon of beauty in which you look a certain way and so on? So is my mother, who's got lines on her face, not beautiful? Is the woman who breaks stones on the ground, her hands, calloused hands, they are not beautiful? What is this canon of beauty? And so the corridors were filled with young women saying, we don't want this stupid tradition of having a Miss Miranda, which was supposed to be the best looking girl over there. And you can imagine, the excitement of these young women who were just charging around the corridors. Dolly, what the corridors of Miranda House are like. And they are sending little subversive notes to the principal of the college saying, show cause notice, why action should not be taken against you. So the students are sending show cause notices to the principal. So this is the excitement, the students' movement, the women's movement, all coming together in a very exciting package. And I started to learn in a sense, my activism by relating to the questions that the students themselves were asking. And I often say this, and I think our relationship is testimony to it. That is, it is not teachers who influence their students only. Students influence their teachers too. And so force them to become something else. What is this? So it's not a one-way street. So anyway, I started learning my history on the job. I was teaching history and teaching history to students. Dolly, you were at least a history honor students. I had students who were subsidiary students. I couldn't hold their attention because they didn't care. They had to get 35% marks to qualify to go into the next class. And I would do anything under the sun. I used to say to them, I will talk to you about anything in the world, as long as I can remotely bring it back into history. So we talk about films, we talk about all sorts of things, and we, sort of came back to. But these were exciting times. It was pre-emergency days. Students were dragging me to price rise movements and so on. So in a sense, we grew into activism together, and we grew into our relationship to history together, students and us. And I learned my history by simply reading and writing and trying to hold the attention of my students, which is a damn tough job. You know that, Dolly. It's so tough to hold the attention of your students because it's always wandering somewhere else. And so I really learned my history at that stage. And then I did become a very, what's it called, a committed historian and a teacher of history. And very soon I wanted to do, I did my first piece of work on Buddhism, but very soon I actually became someone, somehow or the other, I would be working around gender. So in that sense, I think I'm a product of that time, which produced the women's movement. And I've also then in some ways spoken back to my time, because I have also written stories and histories, which are which are about anonymous characters. Now, Ramabai was both known and not known. She was known in small circles, but she also hadn't got her due place in history. And I think that the reason why I wrote that book was because uh, there was this way in which the social reform movement in India was so much the voice of men. It was Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, it was the 19th century men who led the women, as it were, the women's question. And Pandita Ramabai, who had actually lived her life as what I call a proto-feminist, had been ignored completely by the canon, the history canon. I mean, nobody actually put in a chapter on Pandita Ramabai in those days. And so when I went to her, I was going to her as a kind of a foremother of ours who lived her life at her time and asked fundamental questions of patriarchy in her time.
Mom, that's so amazing. You're talking about Miranda House, because when I became your student in 1994, my experience with history honors, and as your first year student, you taught me the first year class you did you did ancient India and European history, and do you remember 1994 also coincides with Susmita Sen and Aishwarya Rai becoming Miss Indias and then Miss World and Miss Universe. I remember that for weeks we froze all classes and we were in a debate, and you were there, Sri Manjari was there, and how much, in a sense, I think we were talking about women and their value. And as I reflect back, I also realized that that was a time of India opening up, of liberalization and of cosmetics, and it makes so much sense, in a sense, of talking about that. And now that you talk about your life in Miranda House, even as a teacher, as a feminist, as a professor, I've always seen how you have been able to integrate what happens around us, both in activism and in your writing. And I think you've always told us stories about 77, the emergency, and kind of like it comes in your documentary on prison diaries. You have always told us about the Sikh riots in the 1980s, and how, in a sense, even as teachers in Delhi University, you all were really part of the political conversation about riots. And way past into the 1990s, I remember, Uma ma'am, you would go to all the meetings and continue to talk with the victims and the survivors of the riots. One of the things that I wanted to actually connect and bring your work, but now focus on activism, was you were part of a trip to Kashmir, talking about rape. And because we're talking about a women's movement, I think I want to provoke a little bit as well. When we talk about Kunan Poshpora, you were very key and central in talking about the rape, where 150 women were raped in one night during a counterinsurgency operation in Kashmir. That happened, Uma ma'am, in 1991. But the Bhauni Devi case, that happened in 1992. And for some reason, within the women's movement in India, the Bhauni Devi case, Rajasthan, is actually invoked as a debate that shaped the movement. What do you think about it? Why is it that when we talk about women's rights and impunity and sexual violence in India, some things are forgotten? And you've been very key, Uma ma'am, in making sure that the women's movement and feminists in the region don't forget these connections. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems with the women's movement has been that it was triggered off by the rape of an ordinary woman. So let's give it its due. I mean, I think sometimes it's said that it was an elitist metropolitan movement right from the beginning, but that's not true, because in a sense, Mathura represents the first coming together of women's groups, and they are not even formed at that stage, is around the campaigning around Mathura. And the fact that the judgment is so outrageous in suggesting that this woman was consenting to the rape. Now, I think that motive is important because it's actually power. In one of the things that the women's movement in India focused on was not the one-off rape on the street or domestic violence and rape at home, it was the thana. It was actually the police station, which was flagged by the women's movement as the first issue that it triggers off. And it is preceded by, it is combined with Ramizabi, who's raped in a police station in Hyderabad, and later on Maya Tyagi, who's also raped and stripped and paraded naked down the streets by policemen. So I always like to flag this. That is, if you look at the issues around on sexual violence, it was not. Why was it in India so dramatically linked to the police station? And I want now to make the connection with state. It is because we had been through the emergency. And because of the linked with the fact that we'd all experienced the emergency, we knew the power of the police to actually unleash violence upon people. They may have been arms of the state, but they had done that. So in a sense, I think that we cannot look at Mathura without looking at the 75-77 period. And then, the discussions around sexual violence were concentrated, not necessarily, they were, I think they were democratic enough in that it is margins and women who are not, do not have political clout that they can bring into their cases. But having said that, one of the problems with the women's movement, to my mind, and I've written about this elsewhere, is that actually we have also been legatees of the nation state. So somehow in India, we have seen ourselves as the pure inheritors of a secular tradition of seeking nationhood. And because Pakistan was formed, on what was seen as on a basis of a minority and a religious minority which seeks to have its own nationhood. In India, we saw ourselves as the inheritors of this secular tradition of nationhood, and it was untainted, a kind of pure whatever. So we took a long time to address the questions of the power of the state to unleash violence upon its own people. And we took a really long time to do that. So 91 came and went without it being acknowledged. I must say, of course, that had been preceded. In 87, fact-finding had been done by Nandita Haksar and others in Northeast, which did test the question of, what is the nation, what are the regions which do not see themselves maybe in. So in one sense, I think the questions began to be pushed to on our right in front of our noses, and it's happening very much in the heartland. But at that time, it was like the consciousness of the women's movement was actually taken in by things that were happening in quote unquote mainland, and did not actually register in the way they should. It took them a long while. But I did notice one important thing is that the first people to bridge that gap were people who did fact-finding in a small way. Now, that is something that Dolly, you and I will particularly appreciate, because even for Kunan Poshpora, yes, the first report that came from India, in that sense the term, was from Amir Rao and Aparna Rao, two women who were like, that report is not even available any longer. So it was they who spoke up, and after that, there were repeated fact findings that were done by women's groups, and so in a sense, we were forced to acknowledge what was going on. But I want to record, this is an archival meeting, so let me record that one plus point I'll give to the women's movement is when George Varghese went off. You remember that, I think it was George Varghese, no? George Varghese, who went and did the first report. Madhu will remember this. He went and then he stayed with the army over there, and he came back and said Kunan Poshpora did not happen because those women were all laughing. So he claimed. So when he came back, I have to say, and this is something that we should remember, I don't think it's been written anywhere. The women's groups we had a meeting, we had a sort of an event in the press club. And this is what he said over there. And he literally got shoes flung at him. They were so furious. They were so furious. Women were so furious.
Going to the archive. So like, thanks for mentioning that.
So yeah, so in a sense, we did take a long while to look at it, but there were also ways in which we were engaging and redeeming ourselves, perhaps to some extent. Okay.
I see what you're saying, and I think this question was both a provocation, but at the same time, in a way, to make sure that you, as the historian who's really been a living historian and a historian on the job, being trained to look at contemporary and the past, connects. One of the things I did history honors with you, then I went on to do law and then anthropology. But history has been such a foundation for me, because time and again, Uma ma'am, I always tell the young feminists and activists, don't forget history, right? And I come from Nagaland, and 97 is a long time ago, but actually it's not a long time ago. Yeah. And you mentioned Operation Bluebird, 1987. So for people who are wondering what is Uma ma'am referring to in 1987, it was Operation Bluebird on a village, Oinam, in Manipur, became very important. And Uma ma'am, I think this is a note that I want to segue into your documentaries. You talk about this idea of secularism that activists in post-colonial India kind of took on, right? And I also find that even among some of the most progressive and the left in India, when they say we, they don't differentiate between the state and themselves, right? There's a habit, even in the public sphere, when we talk about politics, the we is never an organization or a movement. The we is actually the nation. Your documentary Fragments of the Past kind of captures that, because you really show the life of Maithili Sivaraman as somebody who departs to the US and has a radical transformation there. And so can you tell us, Uma ma'am, what drove you to write, to actually write the script for that, direct that, and what were you trying to convey to your audience? Because for me, that's such a powerful documentary, but I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, well, see, in a sense, Fragments was happened, my films have happened by happenstance, okay, rather than conscious decisions. Oh, now I'm going to become a filmmaker, I'll write a script, and then I will shoot accordingly and stuff like that. I've been much more an intuitive person. So I made that first film. I told you I was charged by the archive, and I made that first film. When I made that first film, I was a little unhappy at its tone. If those of you who've seen A Quiet Little Entry will remember that it has a kind of elegiac tone to it. It's about a woman who could not live her life. So there's a kind of sad note to it. And I wanted to end that film with a more rousing political statement from women. And I knew that her granddaughter had become a full-time political activist. So I wanted to put in a sequence which like jumped from the sad woman who unlived her life to a rara speech that was being given by her granddaughter. Now, of course, it did not go with the rest of the film. I mean, my editor shot it down. Obviously, she thought this was whatever. And have never been, I'm always convinced by my editor, but I'm never thwarted by them completely. So I said, okay, then I'll make another film, and I'll make a film on her granddaughter. So that's how the Maithili film happened. But Maithili had been an important person in my life, partly because she'd lived her life in such amazing ways. Now, this film is about a middle-class woman, and there are strands in our lives in which we are the privileged characters who have the opportunities to travel, to study, do whatever it is. But what is it that drove this woman to come back and also live the life that she does? Where she's searching for something. So, Maithili. So for me, then most exciting part of Maithili's life became the fact that she had been two things. She had borne witness to that terrible massacre in the sense that she went to it immediately after, but she had also traveled to the US and come back. And she had come back, and today nobody comes back. Everybody goes and hardly anyone comes back. And here was this woman who just goes and she returns. You look at her life. In the late 60s, America is a churning place. There's so much happening over there. There's the civil rights movement, there's Vietnam on the horizon, there's all of that happening. And so what would you call it? The somewhat, ivory tower existence of the elite groups in India is ruptured when they go to the US, because they are catapulted into another world, which is actually completely different, and she begins to respond to that. So she comes back a changed woman, and the high point of her life is that she goes to Cuba, and she makes that clandestine trip to Cuba, because you can't travel to Cuba and come back easily because of the visa regime. This is still the 60s. The Bay of Pigs has happened, and and it's so full of the American hardline position. So she was completely fascinating. Then she comes back and she goes straight into this agrarian dispute and this terrible massacre that happens to Dalits. So in a sense, the threads that connected her to a whole range of people who in the late 60s and 70s were actually turning idealistic. And they were middle class people, but they were turning idealistic. And in my future film, there's a whole segment on Naxalbari and the women who go off to become part of the Naxalite movement in Bengal and Bihar. So in that sense, I think the middle classes were not leading completely isolated existences. They were actually responding to cathartic moments in their own time. And I don't know if you people noticed it, but then Anupama, I think, is here, and Anupama is, if she's here, she will recall how marvelously she made that cut. There is a cut in the film in which Maithili is in the Cuban section has happened. She's traveled to Cuba, she's done all of that. And then she cuts straight from there to middle class Tamil Brahmin household with women with their diamond nose rings and whatever it is. And that cut is so dramatic because it goes straight from Cuba to this narrow existence of women. But that too is then punctured because Maithili gets a phone call and she's told about this massacre that has happened on Christmas Eve, and that changes her life. So in some ways, there was, let's say, the world was poised to transform some people who were willing to be, or who were drawn to actually questioning and relating to their own society in a way that was beyond the very narrow limitation. So in a sense, that film speaks to me particularly in a certain kind of way because of that moment, when that happens.
I have another question about Fragments of a Past, and it really made me think, and I'm fascinated and very encouraged that her return is not only a return to activism, but I think her stay in the US and also the trip to Cuba connects with what V. Gita, the historian, tells about her life, because her work in the Committee of Decolonization, where she spent time in New York, looking at the debates of decolonization with newly independent nations, really influenced her. So one of the key things that she was able to do, Maman, from your documentary that you show, and I might be just kind of like taking that conversation a step further, but perhaps she came back and really saw that the process of decolonization was incomplete in India after colonial, right? After the transfer of power. And the fact she comes back in 1968. And her return the same year is also 44 Dalits being burned to death in her village in Barmani in Tamil Nadu. So I think that transition was really stark. So for me, I think she is a very, very powerful figure.
Yes, yes, yes. Now, she's absolutely, absolutely very powerful. And in a sense, that, see, the individual, the film may be about an individual, but the individual in her time. And that in her time is the key to why she lives the life that she does. And what maybe connects her even to me, because I knew of Maithili long before I met her, because she wrote about Venmani, and she was published in academic work. So the circuit is very interesting. So she gets published, she writes about Venmani and this terrible incident, and is published in a book in North America by the Indian People's Association of North Americans. Hari Sharma and Kathleen Guff, famous South Asianists, they actually put that book together, and she writes very powerfully about Kilvanmani and what happened. And particularly because those, in the end, those the man who was responsible for the killing gets away. That is, he's exonerated by the system, because it's believed that gentlemen farmers do not kill. So the whole thing is actually an expose of the threads of the state and the lives of ordinary people and the middle classes that might be somewhere in between, bringing these threads together. So there's the state, there's a dominant class, there are people who are on the ground who are actually victims and survivors of the atrocities that are perpetrated on them. And there are a few of these activists who are also there, who intervene and who bring that story to light. So in that sense, those threads are very interesting. And I knew of those stories from Bihar, because there was a infamous case in Bihar, in Rupaspur, where this similar thing happened. So in a sense, these threads are working in multiple ways. They're working as a seen thread and as an unseen thread, because why was I so moved by the story of Maithili going to Venmani? I mean, if it was somebody else, maybe they would not have. It is because in one sense, I was also experiencing and secondary, in a second-hand way, the history of agrarian struggles in North India, and one knew of it. So in a sense, the threads are all linked in strange ways to make the film. And I think every filmmaker is also part autobiographical, seen and unseen. You know, they may be disguised in some ways, and they may be more overt in one sense. But I definitely warmed to Maithili because of who she was and because of what she did, which spoke to me in a certain kind of way as someone. And I was not a historian of contemporary India. I'm a historian of ancient India, you know, but nobody lives in history in silos. You know, you respond to, I mean, there's history all around us, and we are all the time relating to it.
I think, Uma ma'am, because Fragments of our Past really opens up, and for me, you know, with my anthropology now training, the process of decolonizing pedagogy and decolonizing the academy has been so big. And I think this has also been a big question. But having traveled with you both as your student and now as fellow activists and, you know, people who are looking at India, this conversation really, in a way, I think, locates the second documentary that we saw together, Ek Inkalab or Aya. And this is a very beautiful documentary about, once again, voices of women. And unlike the first documentary where you use a lot of archival footage and sources, I see that there's an element of recreation that you're playing around with as a filmmaker, right? So how did that go? So you use a lot of archival footage, but there's a recreation element, and I think you're having fun in terms of the costumes and the staging, and it's all black and white. And sometimes I couldn't figure out whether they were really from the archive or they were really contemporary recreations. So can you share something about that as a filmmaker and as a historian?
Yeah. Well, actually, that's the films are a lot about. They're really about happenstance. Also, you bumble into something, and you suddenly it becomes something that can open up and be a theme of its own. Now, Khatija, the protagonist of Ek Inqilab, she was a she was a she was a colleague of mine in Miranda House. She retired from Miranda House. I knew her very well. Um, and then years later, when I was making my film, and I said and I announced to her that I'm now going to make a film on women who've been to jail for their political work, she said, I also went to jail. And she was already at that time 80. And she said, I went to jail as a 16-year-old in 1949. I said, really? I never knew that. And so then, but I wasn't going to make a film on 1949. I was going to begin the film in 1967. But I thought, what does it matter? Let me do this interview. So I actually did this interview with Khatija. Fortunately, I had a camera person over there. And I did the interview with Khatija. And as I did the interview with Khatija, things started to unfold. The story in the film is about Khatija, but it's also about then becomes the story of her aunt, the aunt who is now. We did not the fact that we did this in that form is a lot to do with my editor Anupama, who also saw the potential of what we were trying to do, because it was again another happenstance. So I was told about Khatija's aunt. Khatija herself told me about her, and when I went to Firangi Mahal, I was told by others there about this aunt. But she was this missing character, and nobody had any photograph of her. If there had been one photograph of her, I would have perhaps maybe Anupama and I may have managed to do something with that photograph to recreate that time. But we couldn't find a photograph. I looked everywhere for it. Everywhere I was told that, her book of poetry was there, and also that there was a photograph, but I could not get either for a while. And so the matter stayed till suddenly 2 years later, I got a link to the book, and I got it first through tracing the niece of Sugra in Malaysia. And she sent me, finally, she had a copy of the book. She photocopied it and put it in the post. It did not reach. And then, thank God for the internet, she scanned the book and sent it to me. And when I got the scanned version of her poetry, I took it to my Urdu-speaking young friend, and he got very excited. And he said, this is very interesting because the range of poems that she's written are very interesting, set in the 1930s, So it was quite exciting to discuss 30s, little after that. So then the idea of somehow creating a segment of Sugra began to appear. It was also interesting because, Anupama, my editor, is a literature person. So she could not only see the value of the writing, but also of the lives. I mean, she's a feminist English literature person plus an editor. So she could actually see the potential in making some sense of this writing itself. And there was this undercurrent of madness that had been put into it, because Sugra was meant to be someone who had spells of madness upon her. So she became this mysterious, elusive figure in the film. So, and the fact that there was no photograph meant that she was that much more elusive, because we couldn't actually access her. So at some point, then the question of creating that stage came up, because again, by happenstance, On and thought out ways, we decided that we would actually recreate this moment, and we did that. And then we chose to. One of the things that, even in a quiet little entry I did, is that I would not give speaking parts to my past. So I would cast them very carefully, but I would not give them speaking parts, minimal speaking parts. So, because somehow I felt that, so it's the whole film is reconstructed through a kind of, through the poetry that these women and the meetings that these women created, so that I didn't turn the the Sugra into someone who only spoke through that one person who was cast to represent her. There was a kind of mahol, and these were strategies that we tried, and and of course my editor ensured that and created that whole, context for the past and in the black and white, and we got a fantastic camera person for that. So in a sense, the film fell into place because of this backstory. And the backstory was of this unseen figure whom actually one is very excited about recovering and bringing into history in a certain kind of way through the poetry that she wrote.
I remember that there was no image, but there was a dress, there was a waistcoat of hers. Yes. That was sent across, and it was very lovely. I think that in itself is such a treasure to understand the past and it through design. Uma ma'am, I would love to keep talking to you, but I think we have to take questions. We have an amazing number of 63 participants. I am dying to ask Uma ma'am about her prison diaries, but as the moderator, I need to be quiet now, give you a chance. So some of you, please ask Uma ma'am about her prison diaries and this fantastic documentary that she made. She has recently also, I think, finished her documentary on Kashmir, so on friendship. So please do not forget to ask her that. If you don't, then I'll take it. I'll take it. I'm Uma ma'am's student, and I can decode talk a lot, as much as she can. So over the decades, so don't give me a chance to talk again. I think you should say. Okay. So yes, so Subasri, we can have questions. I think we can, yeah, you can either unmute, I think you're the co-host, or we can take it in a chat box.
Hi, so does anybody have questions? I do. If not, perhaps I could start with the first one, and we can continue. So what, this is a question. Thank you so much. This was, of course, there is technology and there is Zoom and we all complain about it, but I have felt for the past 1 hour that this has been my own private personal masterclass. So thank you very much. And I also feel like for a series that's named Ways of Seeing and Being as an embodiment, I cannot think of a better person to start the series with. And I cannot actually think of a better person for you to have been in conversation with. So thank you, Uma and Dolly. And the first question I have, this is actually something, I mean, I'm familiar with your work more as a filmmaker than I mean, your writings. Of course, I've read your public writings, but your ancient India work, I'm not that familiar with. But as somebody who's a filmmaker myself, it's a question I've often wondered is, a lot of your work is about testimony making of a certain kind of history and a certain kind of politics, and of course teasing out from the archive, right, which is I feel like as a form of resistance, as you were saying, to not look at the canon to write our histories, but to look at ordinary everyday lives. And the 6 films that you've made over the years is a testament to that. I'm curious, and your films are, I would know, it's a kind of parable, right? It is about the past, but it's actually very much speaking about the present as well. So it's not as if the Prison Diaries film that you're watching, or Ek Inqilab Aur Aaya, or your Kashmir film, or even Fragments from Past, right? It is speaking of the past, but very much it is about the present. And as somebody who's personally interested in it, I see that. But I would be very curious, going in future, what is the kind of work that you see yourself doing? It sounds like a very PC question. Are there things about the contemporary in the real everyday way you'd be curious about or interested in? It's a question I've always wanted to ask you, but I've never gotten around to it. So I'm just going to use this opportunity to do that.
Well, okay. So first, see, the running thread in my films, if you notice, is actually history, but it's about history and memory. It's a lot about memory, how we remember the past. And the past is not accessible to us except through an archive. And so in one sense, when these are women who finished their lives and passed on, how will they be remembered? Except, if there is some way we can access them in flesh and blood. Fortunately for me, Maithili was very much around, but Maithili was also someone who had already slipped into Alzheimer's by the time I started shooting. So, we were talking about this. So this question of how to access memory when even individual memory can collapse or fade or not recall, then who's we are bearers, we are bearing witness to history, but how will that history be passed on to another generation and stay there? Because we will lose these characters, and then we will have no way in which we can actually extract them and make sense of their lives and whatever. So I think cinema, the documentary is a fantastic form in which we can actually do this. And your protagonist can be anybody. It can be someone who's known, it can be someone who's completely unknown. You yourself have done that film on the memory in the context of Nelly, and your protagonists are these two old men who are actually recalling the terrible time that they. So in a sense, I think the individual bearer of history and the bearer of the person who's born witness is someone who's still accessible to us, and we can kind of draw that person out from the recesses of his memory or her memory, and then present it in a way in which it's available, and it's available for our time, and it's available for the future. Each of these films can actually be an archive for the future, because they will be able to speak. Maybe they'll speak differently in different times. So in one sense, I think the question of not losing the person's having borne witness and letting them die without speaking to to a body of people is the reason why Fragments has that quality. Fragments, all the films will have it, but Fragments has that elusive quality of the protagonist being there and not there. She herself has forgotten. And the crisis moment in my making that film came on day 2. You see, she and I had shared this whole relationship on Kilvanmani right from our early days together. And yet when I began to shoot, I shot the day 1, that is the Cuban section, on one day. She was already ailing. So I closed the interview and I said, okay, we'll do the rest tomorrow, because I don't want to tire you out. And the next morning when I we rolled the camera, we started the interview, she said, I can't remember. And she could not remember Kilvanmani, which she had done nothing but go on speaking about. So, the memory itself, her own memory had been, she was losing it. So then who is going to be the bearer of the memory? How is it going to be passed on to the future? Fortunately for me, both as filmmaker and as wanting this testimony to carry on into other generations, she said, I'll have to look up my book. And when she said, I'll have to look up my book, I suddenly got my cue and I said, okay, then you read from your book. And I made her read from the book. And it was in Tamil. So she first read it in Tamil. I said, I don't understand enough Tamil, so now you read it in English. So then she read it in English, and you'll see that in that segment, she's very eloquent. She's actually very articulate when she's reading. I mean, she's making all the gestures, and then she's bringing in the policemen and how they behaved and all the rest of it. So the memory got jogged and through the reading. And I finally got, in a roundabout way, of course, Anupama said it's the toughest film that she's made because her protagonist was not there, I mean, one had to reconstruct her in other ways. But she did give us enough at that point of time to be able to have the segment on Kilvanmani through whatever it is. So in a sense, the films is about passing on to the contemporary present as well as to the future a history which is otherwise going to be lost. And the cinematic medium is particularly powerful in being able to speak to people in a certain kind of way. It's not boring text,
Correct.
So
Correct.
That's where the power lies.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm just going to add, and then there are many questions, that it destabilizes this idea of this is what history is, this is what nation state is, this is the grand arc of how things are. And just that moment, which has always remained with me from your film Fragments. I was at a public screening. Is that sequence in your film where Maithili remembers the Kilvanmani moment, and her response is of a particular kind, right? So her memory may have faded, but how she's responding to it when she's retold that information, perhaps is not very different from how it would have been. So
Yes.
I thought that's a very telling moment.
Yeah.
I would really urge, for those of you who haven't watched this film and the other films, to go watch it. There are a few questions. So I'll start with, of course, Anusha Hariharan. Anusha, hi. I'm Anusha Hariharan. Says, I'm Anusha I mean, it's a comment actually, not so much a question. She says, I'm a PhD student in anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm a longtime fan of Uma and her work, and more recent, but an equally big fan of Dolly Kikon's work. So that's more a statement than a question. Ayerman Chatterjee asks, there is a way in which questions or ways of seeing come in while exploring the world, as the theorist John Berger says. How is visuality and exploring while documenting history and anthropology via archival documents? How does an embodiment play a role in informing this documentation? So that's a question for you, Uma.
Well, I think that's why the documentary. See, I keep saying this, I'll never make a feature film because I'm not interested in representing something. I'm actually wanting very closely to stay with the task, with the job of the historian, which is to tell as closely as possible. Of course, when you choose to highlight particular things, you are already, in a sense, playing that game of saying, this is what I think such and such a person is, and you are interpreting that person. But in a sense, documentary for me is a much more powerful medium, and I will put into it, and my editors have made sure that they do that also, is that there is that emotion, there is that connect to the person, the protagonist, and you sort of let that protagonist speak through her own experience of what she has seen and what she is now telling. So in a sense, you capture that moment in which she's articulating her relationship with her time in a certain kind of way. So I feel that actually I've lost the central point of what you're trying to say. I was going to go on to something else, which is like, what would I do in the future? But I'll defer that for the moment.
Okay, so I'll need somebody from PLD. I think Anupama Chandra raised a hand. Anupama, do you want to ask your question?
Before Anupama, can we just have Aryaman complete, because he had another question?
Yeah, so Udita, I'll let you take it from here. Yeah. Go.
So Aryaman, yeah, you've been unmuted. Please ask your question.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, ma'am. I wanted to ask how embodiment plays a role in documenting, history and questions of anthropology. So when you're looking at a film, how are you viewing the subject essentially? I mean, are you rooting it in the context of your experience as a teacher or as an activist, or as a part the fact that you've been in the women's movement for a significant large amount of time? How are you informing this embodiment is what it is.
Well, I think it's very difficult for me to split myself. I'm an unsplittable character, if I may say so. That's a joke. See, I'm all of those things. I'm the teacher, I'm the history teacher, I'm the historian, the crafts, the writer of history, recorder of history. I'm a women's movement activist, and I'm also a filmmaker at that moment. So all of these are actually playing a role in the way in which I'm relating to the protagonist, the way I ask the questions. See, the questions that I ask my protagonists are themselves, I don't mean, I'm not saying this as an element of, something. They are informed by me, by my history. So my own history as a person actually shapes the way in which I ask the question. This is both an advantage as well as a disadvantage, because I access my protagonist through my relationship to history and to that person, which is the bond that is connected at that point of time, which is born through that relationship that is forged at that moment, and through the particular topic or the issue that I'm trying to explore. So I think that the embodiment, I'm doing all of those things. I'm I'm unconscious of myself as a historian, but I'm very conscious of myself as a product of history myself. So when I ask my questions, or when I push the protagonist in a certain direction, or I think of it when the film is being crafted, and the response to that, all of this is shaped by, I think, who I am as an embodied person, but it's also who that person is as an embodiment of her own history. So to that extent, it's like, it's two characters relating to each other. I think I wouldn't have been able to make these films if I did not have a connect with my protagonists. And I don't mean I needed to know them before. It's that emotional bond you have to make. You have to forge it. Just sitting there and asking your question, you have to forge that relationship to your protagonist, because otherwise you cannot actually get anything, because you're not getting anything fake. You are actually, she's not acting. She's not acting. She's, of course, telling her own story. As I am listening to her story, and I'm asking the questions in a certain kind of way. So I think there are two of us relating to each other, and we then shape the particular way in which she speaks. She herself is responding. So I would see that actually that embodiment is at two levels.
Right, thank you so much.
Yeah. So if I can come in as the moderator, I think you all have to realize, as you are listening to Uma ma'am, that her first book was on the social dimensions of early Buddhism. And she went on to write another book in 2004, The Social Philosophy of Buddhism and the Problem of Inequality. So the entire conversation right now about embodiment and about being, I think is very central. So I would ask you all to actually listen to that as a philosophy of her life, because for her, being rooted really as a living historian, seeing things around. In our conversations, Uma ma'am has shared how studying Buddhism in a way has also shaped philosophy and the way that she sees the world around. I think this is very, very important for us to locate that, right? Philosophy, and both in terms of the women's movement and feminism. If I may take the liberty, there's a question from US Zoom, and it says, Uma ma'am, this is a question for you. To what extent did your own point of view impinge on the protagonist's image in the documentary?
Uh, well, obviously, there is that, there is me as a person who's receiving that history, and I will even in the questions, that the way the questions have shaped and proceeded, and then what the editor will pick as the storyline, as the crafting of the film, as it shapes the protagonist in her own times and whatever it is. I think all of that is actually playing itself out in how the film ultimately gets shaped. And I like to really say, I'm one of the people, I do make clear. See, I wasn't a filmmaker, trained filmmaker. I bumbled into filmmaking. I learned on the job from the feminist friends around me. And ultimately, it is my editors who have crafted my films. So they have actually brought out the soul of what I was feeling. And they are the hands which have been the sculptor's hands that have created the statue at the end, the statue in that sense of the term at the end. So I think in that way, I'm the historian, but they're also historians. They're all actually, in a sense, respond. They may not be historians to start with, but they will become historians as they go along, because they will also relate to the times and read up and experience. Some know it already, and some have to actually read it up. But it comes, So at the end of the day, I think it's sort of an intense process that goes on amongst ourselves.
Thank you. And we have a question from Anupama. So can our team please unmute her? Thank you. And then we'll come to Pooja Das Sarkar's question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. No, this is not really a question. It's a response to what you just said and a few of the questions earlier about embodiment, about the archive, about visuality. I just want to say that, as Uma just said, there's a huge element of choice in how these films are made. You're seeing them like finished pieces. But I would like you to consider what Uma and all of us chose to represent the archive. And in that, I feel that in itself was a feminist action, because what we choose are scraps of paper, long forgotten books, an old waistcoat, a snapshot of an earring. This is the evidence that women, early feminists, leave behind a lot of the time. They are often not given the archive that is given to the other gender. They don't have huge biographies written on them. And I think it's very important, Uma brings her training to this. We all bring our own experiences to it as women. And we read these fragments, and that's why the first film is called Fragments of a Past. We read these fragments differently. And in a way, these unimportant fragments, these fragments that would otherwise be disregarded, become the seed around which the rest of the film gets constructed. Mm-hmm. And so, I find that a very important, a part of the visuality of the film, what we choose to be the archive. It's not that this is the archive. A lot of it will never make it perhaps into any archive. Mm. But because of Uma's choices and all of our choices, they become an archive. Both films have become a different kind of feminist archive. Mm. So that's a very important thing. The second is embodiment. I'm not entirely sure what is meant by that. But in, say, the fictional recreation in Ek Inqilab Aur Aaya, we did have several challenges on how we imagine these women. As Uma said, we didn't have any photographs, right? And sidestepping the usual sort of representation of a mehfil, which comes with certain, overtones of glamour or whatever it is that has come to us from fictional cinema. We decided to go with it rather differently and in a very free-flowing way, which has characterized the making of both of these films, which is just doing things as they come. Uma uses the word bumbling. It may have felt like bumbling then, but now I see it all as a part of a process that was pretty integral. And some of this was like, okay, we'll just do whatever comes naturally to us. So Farah, for example, the woman who plays Sugra, suddenly sent us a text message the night before the shoot, saying that unfortunately it was Ramzan and she was on Rosa, so she could not wear any jewelry or makeup. And we said, fine. We said fine. And she didn't wear anything like that. She was not at all dressed up in any way. And in a strange turn of events, once the film was long over, many months later, we did get a photograph of Sugra. And strangely, there was a very strong resemblance to Farah, not only in face, but also in choice of costume. She was extremely simply dressed. And the fact that I think there is a certain feminist sensibility in not wanting to make a grand gesture. In working with things just as you find them, which Uma was perfectly happy to do. The location that we chose was also not dressed up in any particular way. If you look at the shots closely, you'll see things like electric wires and light bulbs and all kinds of modern fittings in the background of some of the shots. But it didn't matter. Because one was a lot more focused on, as Uma kept saying, evoking the times, and one just went along with it. So I see both films not only as part of a feminist process where Uma, I have to say, didn't hamper the editing at all. She basically let me do exactly as I pleased, and she let everyone do almost exactly as they pleased. So I think both these films in a way are themselves archives of a kind, and I don't mean in the narrative sense. I mean in a formal sense of perhaps indicating what a feminist archive could look like.
Yeah.
This is so important. Thank you so much, Anupama, for this. And there's a question by Pooja Das Sarkar that I really want to take up. And this is a fantastic question, because this question, in a way, is something that Uma's life itself has challenged always. I'm one of her students, and I've always stuck on with Uma ma'am. Every time I come back, I'm in Delhi, I'm always following her around, asking her for more stories. And even as a teacher, the idea of the professional academic is something that Uma ma'am has been very averse to. I'm putting this out there because Uma ma'am, this is about being an academic, right? I don't know if you ever saw yourself in that academic thing. I know we have had long debates, and one of the things that you have told me as your student of, I think, 26 years is never fall into that category. So is being an academic ever an impediment to the act of filmmaking? First part of the question. The second part of the question is, are you ever comparing your research in the academic world to the process of filmmaking, in terms of losing the nuances of tangibility of cinema? I think it's the cinema text, and also I think very importantly, young people thinking about jumping mediums and being a little bit, I think, anxious about these categories we have had. So Uma ma'am, please, you have to take this question, because as a feminist, it's been so important for us.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question, and it's a good question to ask of me. See, I'm a very serious historian. Okay, let's not, I'm not going to downgrade that. I'm a deadly serious historian, but I'm also a intuitive historian rather than a formal historian. So I've never actually made too much of the formal structure of academics. Partly, and I think it's important for us to look at where we spend our lives. I think spending your life in a women's college and spending your entire life there, 40 years of your life with young people around you, and with whom you relate not only on the high academic, paper citing kind of system, but very much from the point of view of the many lines in people's lives which they are exploring at the stage when they are undergraduate students. They're really quite. The undergraduate student is fantastic from the point of view of what that person is going to become, as Dolly herself has shown. I mean, she starts off as a historian, goes to law, does something else, then, ends up anthropology. So I think the undergraduate is place, there's a kind of aliveness to the student at that point of time. And they are also looking for threads that they can pull out in their own lives. So I'm a very serious academic when I write my stuff, but when I was teaching and doing my professional job as a historian, teaching history in a college, I was very keen on bringing history alive for my students. But apart from that, then, everything else in their lives was also of interest to me. And similarly, what was happening to me was probably of interest to them. So in that sense, I was not, fortunately, in the university academy. And fortunately, I did not have API scores to think about. I mean, I think those API scores are the death of every teacher, because at the end of the day, you have to write rubbish on those forms and put it out. We had no API scores. The API scores were what the students thought of you or what the, whatever. So I think in that sense, the academic the academic existence did not exhaust, it did not impinge on my life. And I always did what I felt like doing, while I was a teacher and afterwards. And I was glad. I think I wouldn't have become a filmmaker if I saw myself only as a formal historian. I could see that what I was going to do with my films would be part of history anyway, I mean, part of the crafting of myself as a historian. So that is not something that really hampered me. If anything, it enhanced the possibility of my making the moves that I did. And I always, I always worked well with the younger generation. I was always, bringing other things into their lives. I ran the film club in Miranda House. So actually the connection with films, I curated a film festival of the films made by Miranda House students in Miranda House. So, I was doing those kinds of things. I was always in dialogue with documentary filmmakers. So in that sense, I think that, and so I've seen this filmmaking very as an extension of my historian persona, but and giving me the capacity to imagine things in a certain way, which maybe I would not have had a source that I could cite for. I could do a leap of imagination, which I can't do in the writing of history, because if I were to do that, then I would be hauled over the coals of fire. I would be treated as someone who created a fictive kind of thing. I mean, look at Amitav Ghosh. He's writing historical novels, right? But he's doing leap of imagination all the time. He's not actually writing history. He's constructing, or Sunil Gangopadhyay, the Bengali writer, who writes very interestingly. He crafts fictional history along with real history, and he puts the two together, and runs them. I think cinema, making the documentaries, has allowed me to be creative, to do things which otherwise I can't do. I mean, one of the things I wanted to say when I was watching my own film this morning, see, music is very important as far as my films are concerned. You may or may not notice it, but there are two songs in Fragment. One of them is a mourning song. It's the Opari, and when that Kilmanmani massacre has happened, there is that that's that wail of the Opari is a classic mourning song. So it's that's put there, and it's very artfully put over there because it is a mourning moment. It's a collective mourning moment. So things like music, things like the choice of voice, so the kind of stuff that you put over things is very creative, and you can't do that in writing a novel, writing history. How do you put those elements, the emotional element to be put into history is quite tough, I think. You can write, creatively as a historian, no doubt, but I'm not sure you can actually do what you can when you craft a film. So in a sense, I now see myself as I came to it late, but I don't think I can give up making films till the day I die.
Uma ma'am, I think taking here from craft and forms, we are really looking at the imagination. And you have always done that with young people around, with your students around. And I would like to actually go back to the 2014. Do you remember the International Association of Women in Radio and Television Festival that we were part of? So what, for the record, what Uma ma'am did was that she made sure she invited her former students from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, from other parts of India. She was very kind in a way, once again, to force me to be part of that panel. And she brought us all in a panel, which was really, once again, not an academic panel, but it was, I think, her way of pushing us, once again, to imagine and to think about worlds out there. In my own life, Uma ma'am, because I followed your work and I've been tied in a way to this journey with you, I ended up making my first documentary last year. And I am an anthropologist. I'm still supposed to play around with the text, but I drew a lot of strength and inspiration from you. And I think that the courage came from you. So in a sense, this is tied to two questions, one from Jagriti and one from Sarala. And they are both, in a way, asking you about feminist associations in Miranda House and whether you are ready to actually make something autobiographical.
Well, all my films are autobiographical. I'm in every one of my films. If you'll notice me, I'm there. I'm sometimes there as the voiceover. I'm sometimes there actually physically in some ways, because the relationship with the protagonist is often. I mean, in that last sequence when we go to Kilvanmani, I'm walking with her, and she has in a sense been a huge disappointment because she hasn't remembered Kilvanmani and she hasn't talked to me about Kilvanmani, which has been the basics of our relationship together. But in that last sequence, when we walk together, I actually was pushing her. I was hoping that she will remember, and so I said to her, look, read out the names. There is a memorial that has been installed for the those who died in that fire. I said, I don't know Tamil, read out the names to me. And she starts to read out the names for me. And then she goes in, and then that question is asked about the gentleman farmers, the question that Geeta asks, which leads to that amazing response. So, so in a sense, the fact that this is not only my relationship with the protagonist, but it's also my relationship to myself and history is there in the choice of the bits that are pulled out with the first shoot itself. You're crafting it in a certain kind of way and so on. So I think I'm there in my films quite a lot. You'll find, yes, some more, some less, but I don't think I'd do anything autobiographical. I mean, it's autobiography in any way. This is my times. Why am I moved by Kilvanmani? Why am I moved by the emergency? Why am I moved by women who go to jail today? It is to do with how I feel living in my time. And that is the connection that I make with my protagonists. So I'm very much there in my films.
Uma ma'am, you're very right, because if we look at Fragments of the Past, I'll just take a minute to round up. 41 minutes, 27 seconds and around, I would really ask people to go and look at 46 minutes, 57 seconds. There's a conversation here in around 41 minutes. Geeta and all of you are sitting around a table. So that is a conversation. And that's not even a documentary, that's real life for me, as real life can be for feminists, right? Who are bonding and talking about a photograph. And you're not talking about tension, unhappiness, and anger. Around 46 minutes, what really touched me about the documentary that you make, and once again, it is so personal for me. I feel that in my 40s, we a lot of the time talk about retirement and what is public and political engagement. I think we don't retire. For those of us who have chosen to write and engage, we continue to do that. And your own life, and so many amazing feminists out there, your lives in a way is really a testimony of that. And so for me, that really spoke to me very personally. And I felt that that was, in a sense, your voice. So thank you so much. I would like to give the time to the organizers, to the team, but I think all of us have taken in a lot. So thank you, Ma'am, for your life. And one day I remember in a conversation, you told me, enough, stop being my student, call me Uma. And I told you, no, you'll always be that Uma ma'am for me. So I'm very glad that we are going on record and you'll always be Uma ma'am. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say something that I should have said earlier. This is just so rich and wonderful. Having known Uma all these years, we haven't had this conversation. So it's something that is so valuable. But I will let Subasri Krishnan, a filmmaker, do the wrap up. She's curating the series, and she'll tell us more about what's coming next in the episode. Over to you, Subasri, and thank you, everybody, and thank you, of course, Uma and Dolly, hugely.
Yes, I second Madhu with that. Thank you, Dolly, and thank you, Uma, for so generously sharing your time. Uma, I feel like every time I hear you, and this is not an exaggeration, there's something else and something new I learn. And I think your response in the end was so evocative. This question of, do you see yourself making an autobiographical film? And your response to that is, actually every film of mine carries something of me. And that I see as the place of art and filmmaking in the world, actually, that the films we make, the novels we write, of course, it is about the world outside, but it's also you in some ways, and your work is a testament to that. Of course, I'd be very happy if there was an autobiographical film or somebody made a film on you. I would totally encourage filmmakers here or those who want to make films to do that. But thanks, everyone, and thank you all who joined on Zoom, Facebook, other forms of media to this conversation. I think this recording will be available on the PLD website, if I'm not mistaken. This is the first of the series. There are 5 more conversations that are there. The next one is in the last week of November. Watch the space for more. In that one, there will be Shantha Gokhale, writer, theatre practitioner, who will be in conversation with Samira Iyengar. So watch the space for more. There'll be more information on that. Thank you. This has been a wonderful evening. And thank you, Madhu, Udita, Surabhi, everyone from PLD, who actually worked on this as well along with me. It wasn't just me. So thank you, everyone from PLD as well.